So, yes, it is a dangerous thing to say to me, to be provocative, but actually it's dangerous in a way because I'm at risk of being a bit anticlimactic, so I'll have to try and step up to the plate. And what I'm going to say, actually, it's a real privilege to be here. Thank you for inviting me. The discussion so far has been really interesting, and I'm going to pick up a lot of themes that are really being focused on already in a number of ways. Issues about pathways, plural, that Kevin Rama identified at the beginning, to sustainability. It's not one thing. Issues of the evidence that came up in the last session. How clear are we about what constitutes sustainable energy in general, and how well we know the implications of the different options? What role does power play in this? I'm going to outline some of these issues in a rather high concept way, hopefully in a useful way, that will then feed into what I know Peter and Linus are going to pick up on in other ways in the next two talks. So, pathways to sustainable energy, issues of power, diversity, and transformation. I've not just jumbled together words I like there. I hope by the end of my 15 minutes you'll see why I put it that way. And in doing this, I am taking the broad steps approach, summarising some of the key issues in that, in particular looking at some of the themes that were raised in the STEPS manifesto, which several folk in the room collaborated with us on, which we're very grateful, and we're still working on it internationally to develop it, and it's out there on the board with a lot of other documents. So, I'm going to take a step back. Forgive me, those colleagues who've heard me bang on about this ad nauseam on other occasions, but I think it's interesting to reflect about the general context of how society thinks about technology and innovation in general. You can't stop progress. It's a one-track, hardwired process of going forward into the future, whether you look at mainstream discourse, whether you look at the pronouncements of senior political figures worldwide who are not normally associated with each other in such similar ways, but when it comes to talking about the role of innovation and progress, they are actually in lockstep with each other about that you can't impede this thing, this is our big hope, all innovation is progress, and in the European Union, as around the world, government policies, even collective identities, as is the case in the European Union, are based on this idea of innovation taking us forward in some unambiguous fashion. So whatever the sector, beyond energy as well as within energy, we have this idea of a supposed singular future. Technology is taking us there. It's a race. Countries are racing with each other. It's technology that's going to determine our future, not the other way around. And the challenge of government is to stay in that race, and the role of the public is to just knuckle down and give technology the status it deserves, to use the language here of the Royal Academy of Engineering president, but the similar language was used by Mark Malloch-Brown as Deputy Director General of the United Nations. So we are in a debate about technology in the energy sector as elsewhere, where innovation is homogeneous. There's no room for particular distinctions or politics or choice. The questions are simply about yes or no to some particular option. If you say no, then you're anti-technology in general. If you oppose wind turbines, you're anti-technology. If you oppose nuclear power, you're anti-technology. So we ask questions like how much, how fast, who's leading. We don't ask questions in this wider debate about which way, who says, and why. Now, I've rehearsed that very quickly, because when we come to issues around sustainability, and in particular sustainable energy, one would have thought we would get out of this syndrome. After all, sustainability is a subset of the possible things we might do with the energy system. But actually, and this is hopefully a provocative bit, because I might flash up a few titles that are very close to some people's experience here, we hear about the energy transition. In fact, even the grand energy transition. The singularity and definitiveness of this is emphasised time and again in pronouncements by intergovernmental agencies, by big business, by NGOs, by governments, by academics. Governing the energy transition. Reality, necessity, these imperative words, this singularity, it's a singular imperative with not a lot of room for discussing the various political dimensions and the choices that lie within. Partly because the choice to actually do it at all is such a controversial and tricky thing. So we get these very elaborate scenarios and visions, government picks up on it, in order to collaborate with business to work towards the transition as if it's self-evident what that transition actually is. In civil society, we see all sorts of companions and handbooks, timelines nicely organised for how the transition is going to take place. You have modelling exercises, such as this influential one at European level, talking about, you can't really see that, but it talks about independent, comprehensive facts, emphasising the technical basis for deciding this nature of this singular transition. You get roadmaps, often unlike any roadmap I know, because there's only one road. You don't really need a map if there's only one road. And this is brought out here in a particular document where it's the road in the context of Nigeria. I'm not intending here to disparage any of this work because I think it's crucial to forming a kind of head of steam. We all know what's going on. But the implication is, as emphasised for instance here, just like the bigger picture, the same syndrome, you might call it, to be controversial, a pathology is in play. We don't see the scope for politics. The questions about sustainable energy are what cost and what speed, not about which direction. Why is that a problem? Well, we've already been talking about it in all sorts of ways. I just want to bring it to the fore. What constitutes low carbon energy is highly ambiguous. It's not a transition, let alone the transition. It's multiple different, not only pathways, but transformations that could happen. There are a vast array of different configurations of access, services, behaviour, let alone technology, demand, supply, which could constitute alternative pathways to this thing called low carbon energy. And not all that is imaginable, conceivable, technically feasible, economically and socially viable will actually prove realisable. We will lock in, we will close down. The things we do will be a subset of the things we might have done because of a whole series of different processes that act to close down the choices that we take as a society. Social studies has talked about a lot of processes, social shaping, the way expectations about the future feedback in very positive ways to reinforce certain practices, the way imaginations work, the space program, the domestic appliances that are supposedly at a household basis are examples of this. Historical contingency, just random chance, the QWERTY keyboard locked in for more than a century with no powerful interest protecting it. We just can't get out of it. Issues of momentum, issues of active path creation by business, further narrow down the kinds of choices that get made from all the possibilities. Autonomy, where debates, wider debates in society are actually configured actively in order to foster certain choices rather than others. We see that at the moment internationally in this huge political economy of the struggle for and against nuclear power. Now I'm summarising a whole lot of processes. I think people in the room will be really well aware of many of these. Another one is lock-in. Even in competitive consumer markets, we face very powerful positive feedback effects that reinforce choices early on, even when they're manifestly inferior in a consumer market, like certain kinds of software, not too far from our presentation at the moment, media formats and so forth. If this happens in competitive markets, how much more does it happen in large, long-lived, pervasive infrastructure choices? So this is the nature of technological change, it's the nature of so-called transitions. And what the STEP Centre is trying to do to get to grips with this is go beyond the idea that the politics comes in after the knowledge. You know, knowledge is power. Power also frames knowledge. So how we think about sustainable energy, how we answer the question, what is sustainable energy, differs radically, depending on how we look at different material and social realities around it. So different perspectives will look at the whole array of material and social realities in different ways. This isn't a anything goes relativism. It's just that any object, any real world thing can be seen from different perspectives. So how we answer the question, what is the energy system? What is sustainability? Which are the patterns of cause and effect? What values can we assign? Differ radically between the kinds of groups we've been talking about in society who are affected by these systems and implicated in them. So what I'm trying to say here is if we're talking about local people, unemployed people, farmers, people working within the energy system, potential employees in industrial cities that could be in the supply chain, and so forth. There are different interests, different intentions, let alone big business, the World Bank, There are radically different ideas about what constitutes sustainable energy, and over time, these have the effect that I've tried to outline of reinforcing themselves. The discursive, the social, the material reinforce to come up with certain types of pathway rather than others. And so the STEP Centre is trying to get to grips with this in a way that combines many different disciplines and look at the power relations, the imaginations at one end of the spectrum. The role, for instance, of the military is not insignificant in a lot of energy policy decisions around the world, but doesn't generally get brought into the frame. Different types of expectations and discourses around the way things should be done, moving through to interests, technologies that are available, choices. These kinds of things are self-reinforcing trajectories of change, and they all need to be addressed in different ways. And we're trying to come up with tools and methods that allow us to illuminate these things, and especially cast a light on the kinds of choices and possible pathways that otherwise get missed out. So let's be a little bit more pragmatic. We heard earlier about the evidence and how clear-cut it is, and there's no doubt at all in my mind, from my perspective, how clear-cut it is, but unfortunately not everyone sees it that way. So we typically get, whether it's in an evidence-based assessment of different energy technologies or the transition visions that drive a lot of the initiatives we are talking about in the world at the moment, you get an apparently clear-cut picture of how sustainable a particular technology or set of practices or policies might be. And it's only when you step back and look at a whole set of assumptions in the literature as a whole that you see that actually it's much more ambiguous. There's enormous room for disagreement between pessimistic and optimistic pictures of what counts as sustainable, even for an option like nuclear power here. This is a real set of figures looking at the sustainability of energy technologies in terms of economic criteria, including cost factors. It's the externality. So when we look at a range of different strategies, technology strategies or policy strategies, you typically see a picture like this. No matter what the method, it's not down on the externality assessment method, whether it's life cycle analysis or deliberative appraisal, all sorts of methods lead to these overlaps, where you could basically justify any choice you like among the different low carbon energy options as being the most sustainable if you pick and choose among the evidence that there is, the evidence basis out there. So one of the ways in which one can get to grips with this is to see the appraisal of what counts as a sustainable energy strategy as, forgive the jargon here, a plural and conditional process. I think that says 5, does it? It says 5. Good. I'm short-sighted, it's my usual excuse, so I just go on endlessly. Plural and conditional. Plural, because rather than the usual studies or consensus conferences or citizens panels or whatever they may be, delivering a single idea, this is the best thing for this context, you actually say, well, what's good for this context depends on how you look at it. There's typically different groups. Maybe the women and the men, maybe the donor agencies and the local people, it depends. Will have radically different ideas. The politics is in the knowledge, not after the knowledge. And you can elicit that using all sorts of different practical techniques, multi-criteria mapping, deliberative techniques, ethnographic methods, or some combination. So instead of the picture I just showed you before, where you narrow it down to a single picture, you look at what the academics are saying, the banks are saying, the different industries are saying, the grassroots NGOs are saying, and how they relate to each other. You get a picture out of what the best available evidence looks like. You rule out some things as a result. But then you ask political questions. You deliberate over the different scenarios, the values, the interests, the assumptions. And on that basis of openly political discussion about the conditions governing this plurality of pictures of sustainable energy, you can then, as a political matter, settle on particular decisions rather than others for what looks in that context like a reasonable pathway to sustainability. Leaving the space for accountability and politics and democracy in the choice as well, not treating it as a technical or participatory fix. And diversity pops up as well, an issue that is central to the manifesto. We talk about looking at the direction of change, really being serious about the different directions for sustainable, in this case, energy pathways. The distributional issues are not just about how you get trickled down after the fact, but how much attention you pay to different people's knowledge about what is sustainable, what would work in a different context. And then realising we don't all agree, we have different interests, we're uncertain. So looking at diversities of options. And we've tried to come up with tools to characterise diversity. Instead of looking at what's best, what works together. which can be an interesting way of developing kind of common ground between different groups, which otherwise might be difficult. Taking seriously the fact that different options are more different from each other than others are. This is an attempt to show the diversity of different options. I haven't got time to go into it, but it's just in a way of illuminating this very important quality of diversity that we've been working on. And a subset of these things might look in a political context as being more sustainable than others. Let's talk about it. And let's still decide. In fact, we can decide more quickly and more efficiently because we haven't spent a lot of time paralysing ourselves with analysis or participation that seeks to try to claim there's only one possible answer. But the decision is justified more politically. So I'll skip by that. My final slide is to summarise what I'm trying to say in this rather overexcited account. The reality of sustainable energy is we face multiple different pathways. The traditional way of analysing these is to look at particular options which happen to have come to the fore in a particular context, to presume particular visions of sustainability, to narrow down the perspectives around the table, to aggregate the different metrics in particular ways, to be captured by regulatory process or business interest or sometimes NGO interests, to have technocratic procedures. That delivers a picture like this. Then power further closes down. What you tell policymaking is, we think this is best. You don't say why, you don't say the conditions, and you therefore give single expert opinions or consensus from the participatory process as an output. And that reinforces the processes I spoke about earlier, which lock us in to particular options much too quickly. Instead, we can broaden out what counts as evidence, what counts as perspectives, doing the kinds of things I mentioned very quickly, looking at diversity, looking at what the most marginal interests and perspectives have to say about what counts as sustainable, what makes sense in their lives. But not only that, also when it comes to talking to policymakers, don't crunch it down to a final single answer. Illuminate why one might choose one thing rather than another, and make different choices. This plural and conditional process. Open up the politics. Transitions depend on the context and perspectives. And let the decisions still be made, but be accountable politically, and also to maybe be a bit more diverse in what they support than would otherwise be the case. Because in the end, diversity is a really interesting property. We can't crunch out what the right answer is by deliberation or analysis, as I've tried to show. What we can do is look at what mixes of options, what mixes of pathways fit best together in any different context. And in the process, we learn about the future, we don't put all our eggs in one basket, we accommodate different value judgments. Diversity is not a panacea, but it has a lot to offer in sustainable energy as in other areas of our technological debates. So I apologise for being so rapid in that. I hope I've set out a few ideas that may be picked up or challenged. I hope I've been a bit controversial. Thank you very much.